All right, folks. I'm just going to start right into this video about Paulogia, and then we'll start the discussion.
Cameron at Capturing Christianity just pulled a Krusty the Clown.
Oops, I said the quiet part loud and the loud part quiet. Oh, dear.
As he throws his friend Jonathan McLatchie under the bus.
So he thinks the New Testament is generally reliable and that we can therefore use it to establish facts that most historians would actually reject. This is a huge burden on anyone who wants to argue for the resurrection.
After low.
All right, folks. So this is Paulogia, who is a YouTube skeptic, atheist. I believe his story is that he was a former Christian and has since turned atheist. I've seen a lot of different things on his channel, and I generally think he does a really good job with the atheist and skeptical position. I think especially in this video, he does a fantastic job of dealing with some pretty poorly framed arguments from, I believe his name is Cameron, from Capturing Christianity, whose channel I've also seen a lot of material from, and is also largely good. I like a lot of the stuff that I see on his channel, but I think he did a really poor job in the video here. The third person mentioned here is Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, who I've followed a lot of his work and generally find his work to be great. He's not really featured in this video, so I don't think there's a whole lot more to say about him here, but generally find his work to be great. So all three of these people, I think, are all known to those who are in the field of apologetics, Christian skepticism, atheism. You've probably come across one or all three of these gentlemen at some point in time in the past. So let's let this video play a little bit more, and I'll frame the discussion that we're going to have here.
These many years, has Cameron finally released a video that exposes the intellectual side of Christian belief?
But I'm not talking about some abstract philosophical argument.
You're not talking about an abstract philosophical argument.
Yo, kid, you've changed, man.
You've changed. Welcome to...
All right. So as I mentioned, Paulogia, former Christian, now atheist. And in this video, what I want to talk about are two things in particular. So the first is evidence. How do we look at evidence? How should we be looking at evidence? And the second is how I view my role as an apologist. On the second point, I'm going to start with that first and deal with that very quickly. So when I think of apologetics, and I think I've touched on this briefly in other videos, generally the notion is, from the origin of the word, is one who sort of defends the faith. So defending the faith against heretics or skeptics or those who are otherwise critical, in this case in particular of Christianity, defending against them. Within the world of apologetics, I think there are multiple different approaches that can be taken on how one chooses to go about that work. I would say that I think there are kind of three broad categories of audience that an apologist can focus on. And there may be more, but at least come off the top of my head, I'd say there are three. So one would be those who already believe, those who are already believers and just need additional reaffirmation of their faith or help supporting arguments that they're already inclined to believe. So that's group one. Second group is those who don't believe at all. So atheists, skeptics, and I would say not only do they not believe, but they're very unlikely to be persuaded to belief. I would put Paulogia in this category. I know that his stories that he previously was a believer, so maybe he's in the third category that I'm about to relay, but for now, I'd put him in this category, and if I'm wrong about that, someone can correct me. And then the third are those who are unsure. They're the group of people who's seeking. They're indeterminate. And for a long period of time, I would put myself in this third bucket. So I was never full-fledged atheist, but I went through a long period of time of skepticism, and particularly skepticism to frank doubt about the veracity and truthfulness of the gospel accounts and of the Christian narrative. I always had a space, I think, in my heart and my soul for some kind of higher purpose, some kind of higher being. I don't think I ever lost that. But in terms of believing in Christianity, believing that Jesus was the Son of God, that he was resurrected, rose from the dead, the Trinity, I didn't believe it for a long time, just despite going to Catholic school and all of that. I went away from that as I started, in my college and postgraduate studies and everything else. I moved completely away from any belief in any of this. And so, but I never moved so far away that I wasn't willing to hear good arguments. And in general, that I think has been true throughout my whole life. And so those who are unsure and seeking are the group of people that I try to target my content toward the most. So that's a bias of mine. I'm not saying any one group is right or wrong or any approach is better than the other, but that's a bias of mine. So I want to set that out up front. And in doing so, I think my job is to respond to those in that second bucket, to those who are atheists and skeptics and are unlikely to be changed, to try to go tit for tat with their arguments, and then to take the arguments of those who either purport to be neutral or those who are otherwise characterizing arguments and try to present the facts and the arguments as I understand them in as unbiased and secular way as is possible, so that they can be absorbed by someone who's not yet ready to go all the way into believing full-fledged into Christianity. The reason I mention this is because I think that there is a disservice done to this third group of people when evidence is not presented clearly and accurately, and the facts aren't presented clearly and accurately. I think a disservice is done to the group of people who are seeking. So there may be reason why when one is engaging in apologetics, they feel the need to reaffirm something to those who already believe. And so they may not feel the need to get into the detail of evidence and facts for someone who's not a believer. So I can understand that and I can appreciate that. I have nothing against that. But for the person who's seeking, they may come across those arguments and be confused by them. And I think with respect to Cameron's arguments here, I think that's what's happening. Obviously Cameron is a Christian. I understand his faith journey has recently moved from being a Protestant to a Catholic. I don't have a dog in that hunt. I don't have skin in the game there. As I said, I've went to Catholic school because that was the school my parents sent me to, but I don't ascribe to any particular denomination of Christianity at this point. I like bits and pieces of all of them, and so I really don't. I don't even have enough clear understanding of the precise doctrinal differences to really wade into that. But my understanding is that Cameron has gone on that journey, and that certainly influences some of the content that he is putting out right now. So I believe that everything I understand about Cameron and his channel is that he's a full-fledged Christian. So nothing I'm saying is trying to cast doubt on that. And so his arguments aren't really meant to get to, from what I understand, to the seeker who has not yet made a determination yet about whether they want to accept any of this or not. And that is what I find to be dangerous here. So I will pause the video. I will resume the video here and just pause my commentary before I get any further into this. Really quickly before I continue, let me just say one additional thing about Paulogia. I think Paulogia does a very good job in this video of bringing the atheist point of view to the arguments put forth by Cameron, and I think Cameron sets himself up entirely for this rebuttal. I think Paulogia this was a very easy lift. There was really no difficult work that had to be done here because the arguments that were being made by Cameron are inherently self-defeating, and so the focus of this video, even though this is Paulogia, is really not going to be on Paulogia. I think he did pretty much everything, from my perspective, exactly as I would expect a skilled atheist to do in this video. The focus here is really on Cameron and capturing Christianity. And when we get done with this next clip, I'm going to discuss what I think the main issue here, which is two different categories of evidence and the different burdens that apply to them. So let's move on here.
Apologia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. In the recent video, the best evidence for Christianity isn't in the Bible. Cameron attempts to call out his Protestant brethren for not jumping aboard the Catholic Marian apparition train. In just a minute, we're going to first compare the epistemologies of Cameron and Jonathan to see who wins, and then evaluate the actual evidence for this Zeitoun miracle. But I first want to front load this video with Cameron's shockingly prescient admissions that I don't think he'd have made back in his sola scriptura past.
This is very serious evidence. And if you're thinking like, wait, this actually does kind of sound stronger than our evidence for biblical miracles, you would be right. We do have eyewitness testimony, but...
Okay, so I'm going to pause here. Again, the backdrop here is that Cameron is discussing the Marian sightings, the Marian apparition sightings at Zeitoun. Different conversation for a different time. I'm familiar with the story. I don't want to claim to be an expert on it by any means. And it's not the point of this video to characterize whether that was a Marian sighting or not, or whether it was a miracle or not. But that's the backdrop here. And the argument, the subtext to the argument here is that if you're a Christian and you're basing your arguments about the resurrection of Jesus on the Bible accounts and the evidence that we have to support those, and you're saying, based on these accounts, I argue and believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead, the argument is then, well, then how is it that when you see the Zeitoun events that you don't even go further with those and affirm those as being miracles as well? Because for a number of reasons, the evidence is alleged to be better. That's the argument Cameron makes. There's a real problem with that, and I think this is where I want to kind of structure the video going forward. The primary issue here is that within these stories, within both stories and all similar stories, we have what I would say are two broad categories of evidence. We have evidence in category one that's of the facts of what happened, or what's alleged to have happened. The who, the what, when, where, those kind of facts. It was in this location, John was there, Sally was there, it happened at this time. There's that set of evidence. Then there's the evidence that purports to prove the events that are described. The evidence that says, and therefore Mary appeared miraculously. Therefore Jesus resurrected. Therefore the homicide was committed by Sally, right? Two different categories. So one category here has a relatively reasonable and lower burden, and the other has a much higher burden. Now, when I talk on this channel, you will hear me oftentimes talk about who has the burden in an argument. And I will state clearly that my point of view is that if you're going to point to the Bible, the gospel texts, Acts, Luke, Acts, Paul's epistles, if you're going to point to that as your evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, say, hey, because of this evidence, this proves Jesus resurrected from the dead, you are the one who bears the burden of making that case. It's not on the skeptic. It's not on the atheist. It's not on the seeker. You better bear the burden there. So I want to be very clear about that. I'm not arguing that I don't believe that. In fact, I do. Just as a sidebar, that is my personal belief. But the grounds for that, I think, are beyond the scope of this particular talk. Maybe I'll touch on it a little bit later. But it's you who bears that burden. When it comes to establishing certain facts of things that happened or did not happen, with respect to these narratives, I think it depends. And I think in many situations, it's the skeptic that bears the burden of disproving the facts. As long as those two are lumped together, though, it's easy work for someone like Apologia to just dismantle the arguments. Because if you're going to lump them together, he's just going to shred the entire thing as he should. So let's talk here quickly about, give a couple quick examples here of the type of evidence that I'm putting in this first bucket, which is just the who, what, when, where evidence, the actual evidence of the facts, the historical evidence that separates out entirely anything supernatural. And my request for this particular video is that you sort of grant me, just indulge me on this one point of view, which is that the gospel accounts, the stories that are being told in the gospels and with Paul are historical. Okay, you don't have to believe that outside of the context of this video. You can say this is all myth, it's all made up, it's nonsense, folklore, legend. You can do all that outside of this, but just so that we don't have to spend a lot of time here trying to do a bunch of work to try to establish the historical nature of these events. We'll cover that, and I cover that in other videos, and we'll cover that again. Just for the purposes of this particular discussion, just if you'll just give this one thing and just say, okay, you know what, I'll just grant that the things that you're talking about here could be historical or are historical. That's the only thing I'm going to ask of you, the listener here, for this video. That's the only request I'm gonna ask for, to just take without argument. Okay. So given that you're going to grant that particular thing for the purposes of this video, we have a category of evidence that we can look at and say this evidence is just a who, what, when, where factual evidence of what happened. And so within that, there's this question of eyewitness evidence. What do we have? And I'm going to let this portion of the video play from Paulogia and then come back and discuss that.
From a small number of people.
And by small number of people, he means just one person. Just one, the only document where the author identifies himself and claims in first-person verbiage that they saw the risen Jesus is Paul. And most people understand that Paul is problematic because whatever it was Paul experienced wasn't of the same nature as the other resurrection claims. This was years later, so Jesus would have had to come back to earth a second time in bodily form if you want to argue that it was the same. But that very much contradicts other claims. But that's already...
So this, as framed by Paulogia, and if you accept the assumptions that are implicit here, what he's saying is correct. So if we talk about if to be an eyewitness in this context, we're talking about somebody who's come forth and said, I, insert name, witnessed these events, then yes, we only have Paul. Now, what's unstated here is that the backdrop that Paul, I'm assuming his name is Paul. Actually, I don't really know. I'm going to assume that's his real name. Is relying on here to make his arguments. The backdrop here is that the gospel accounts, particularly Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then we'll just set aside John for now, just to not muddy the waters here too much. The synoptic gospels, Paulogia's position that he doesn't state here, but that is implied, is that those are not eyewitness accounts. Now, as I said, I've asked for this indulgence that we accept that for this discussion, we're reciting historical events here. I'm going to go to Matthew and use Matthew as an argument for why that's true. As a very quick sidebar, I've done, if you followed other videos in this channel, you'll see I harp on mark and priority and the erroneous nature of mark and priority elsewhere. I'm not going to do it here. What I'm going to state here is definitive, and I'm not going to back the argument up too much here. You can go to other videos to look for that. But we're not permitted to hold the position that Mark was first. We're not permitted to hold that position based on the evidentiary record we had. You're not permitted. I'm not permitted. No one's permitted. If that bothers you, I'm not asking for your indulgence on that one. If that bothers you, you need to go look at the other stuff that I've done and come back to me with an argument for why I'm wrong. What I'm going to say is, with the record that we have, Matthew is first, and all other arguments about priority cannot be taken with the record that we have. Okay, so if this sets you up and you're just ticked off and you're just want to throw things, or go ahead, right? Don't even bother coming in the comments arguing this, because unless you're going to come with evidence that tells me why I'm wrong, evidence beyond scholarly consensus, we're not going to entertain that position here. So Matthew's first. Now, and I'm not looking for your permission on that. Okay, so I'm just asking you to accept that these accounts can be historical, and that's it. This one, if you want to disagree with it, if you want to disagree with Matthean priority, go ahead, but show me the evidence for why you're doing that. Now, okay, if Matthew's first, there are a number of things that come out of that, and one is that there's a better story than not that the person who contributed to the accounts in Matthew was an eyewitness. Could he be anything from the Apostle Matthew or someone writing on the Apostle Matthew's behalf, etc. It's not the purpose for here, but the argument that the accounts in Matthew come from eyewitness testimony is strengthened, one, when Matthew is put first, and also when the ramifications from that are considered. Because if Matthew is first, the kind of back end, there are no discussions in Matthew, Mark, or Luke of any events, Luke Acts, of any events past the early 80s, 60s. No discussion in there. So, other videos we'll talk about dating. We'll get into the just the fraught and problematic mainstream scholarly position of gospel dating, which is just erroneous and assumption laden in so many different ways. But for our purposes here, we can just look at the text and say Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not recite any events of history past the early 80s, 60s. The later documents, Josephus' Antiquities and other documents that came later do discuss these. There's no discussion in Matthew, Mark, Luke of Nero's persecution. No discussion of the temple being actually destroyed, an AD 70 event. It's not in there. And so, again, when we talk about who bears the burden, the stronger case, based on this evidence, is that these documents were written before that. If you want to get into the wild and fantastical arguments about Josephus and how Josephus influenced Luke, Acts, and maybe some of the other Gospels, feel free to do that. But you're out on shaky ground with dubious arguments and dubious evidence, namely that Josephus does mention those events. Luke, Acts, Matthew, and Mark don't. So if we're going to argue about which one we think came first and who influenced whom, it's far more likely that Josephus was influenced by the Gospels than the other way around. I'm not going to argue that. It's your burden to show why that's not true. So here we are now, and we have a set of documents that just describes events no later than the 60s. So I'm going to, for the purposes of this discussion, say they're not later than that. Okay, we can have a different conversation. Show me the evidence. Show me the manuscript. Show me the archaeological evidence. If you want to say it's later, I'm open to looking at it. I've looked for it. I've not seen it. And if Matthew is the first amongst those three, Matthew would have been written in very close timing to the events that occurred, within 10, 20 years maybe earlier. And so the better argument, I'm not saying this is definitive, okay, but the better argument is that if the argument between could Matthew have been an eyewitness or could Matthew not have been an eyewitness, the better argument on this record is that Matthew could have been an eyewitness. And so if that's the case, then we don't just have Paul. Now, I want to get into Paul's, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the testimony that comes from Matthew, but just this one single eyewitness, no one else story can only be held if we reject that at least Matthew was an eyewitness account. Now, let's just look at Paul, and we'll take Paul and take Paulogia's arguments with respect to Paul at face value. I want to turn to sort of the relevant accounts from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But before I do that, I want to get into the two different categories of evidence that we need to look at here. So when we look at Paul's testimony in 1 Corinthians, there are two different categories of evidence, as I stated earlier, that we're going to be looking for. The first category is the who, what, when, why. What happened? What was purported to have happened? And then the second is going to be, does this prove that Jesus resurrected? Let's take the first category. So, Paul testifies in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures." Verse 4, "And that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures." Verse 5, "And that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Verse 6, "After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep." Okay, so that's Paul's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Some excerpts from there, verses 3 through 6. Start with verse 3 and verses 4, where Paul is talking about getting what he has received from the Scriptures. Now, there are those who argue this in different ways, but the better argument here as between is what Paul is referring to here as the Scriptures, something akin to what we now call the Gospels, maybe the Gospel of Matthew, maybe in a well-preserved oral tradition, or is it some other thing, some other long-lost thing, or Old Testament, or something else? The better argument is that Paul is referring to something akin to what we refer to as the Gospels today. It's another argument for another time. If that throws your hair on fire and pisses you off, tell me why. But the more reasonable argument, and I'm not the only one who makes this, that what Paul's referring to here as the Scriptures is something tangible that either is early accounts, likely written accounts of these events versus some other thing. I don't know, you can insert whatever that is. The better argument is that Paul is referring to something that's been brought to his attention that makes these claims. Something written, most likely, or at the most strongly preserved in oral testimony, to the point that it's as valuable as being written. That's important, because with the two categories of evidence we've talked about, Paul is giving his testimony as to what he has received, what's come into his possession, what's come into his worldview of knowledge. It's not necessarily an affirmation that the events that he received are true. That's a separate argument. But what we can say here is that Paul is saying that this has come to my attention. It's come to my attention the following things. That is very powerful evidence in this context and in any other context. Extremely powerful evidence of the facts that are being purported to have been received by Paul. So let me just be very clear on that. When Paul says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, it's extremely strong evidence that Paul received that information from the scriptures. Whether Christ in fact died for our sins, this doesn't on its own carry all the water for that. But whether Paul received that bit of knowledge from the scriptures, that factual point from the scriptures, is extremely strong. Paul says that he received that Christ was buried and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Very, very, very strong evidence that Paul did receive that. And that it was from a source, a credible source, a source that Paul held in high regard. Whether in fact Jesus actually did raise on the third day is a separate. There's a foundation laid here, but there's more work that needs to be done to get there. That Jesus appeared to Cephas, Peter, and then to the 12. This is information that Paul has come into knowledge of. So when Paul is testifying, this is what I've learned. He's absolutely entitled to make that representation. You'll see later here there's going to be a discussion about hearsay, and a lot of people talk about hearsay and kind of get the concept wrong. It is not hearsay for Paul to say, this is what's told. It was told to me that Jesus appeared to Cephas, and was told to me that Jesus appeared to the 12. That statement is not hearsay. Okay? It's not. I'm not trying to get into the legal arguments or whatever about hearsay, but Paul making a statement is not hearsay. If the argument that is being put forth is that all we're trying to establish is that Paul received this information from someone else, from something else, it's not hearsay. If we're trying to argue that therefore Jesus did in fact appear to Peter and the 12, okay, then you could argue that is hearsay. That doesn't necessarily on its own undermine the evidence, but we got to be clear about those two different things. And what we're trying to do right now is just establish the first framing, which is that Paul received this information. And then Jesus appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remained until now. First of all, it's good evidence of dating. This must be relatively early, by looking at this text. And but more to the point, again, this does not prove that Jesus did in fact appear to 500 people, but this does go a long way toward proving. Again, because with all this, we never get to 100% certainty when we look back on any historical event or any evidence, especially from antiquity. We never get to 100% certainty. So if I sound like I'm hedging, it's because that hedge is necessary for any bit of historical testimony from anything, from the Civil War, all the way to this. But as good of evidence as you can possibly have that Paul had learned of testimony that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, as good as it can possibly get from history, from a single source, we have that here in Paul. So this is really good evidence that the facts, the things that are claimed to have happened, that those facts happened. Jesus' apostles believed that he appeared to them after the crucifixion. 500 people believed that Jesus appeared to them after the crucifixion. This is extremely good evidence that those things are true. What happens here with Cameron is he lumps that evidence in with the evidence that this therefore then proves that Jesus resurrected. There is an argument that can be made for that from this, and it's a much broader argument that we're not going to make here. But it's only when those are lumped together that this evidence becomes much weaker, because the supernatural claim that has to come from accepting that this therefore proves resurrection is a very high burden claim that we who are arguing that have to meet. And I'm not saying it can't be met, but I'm saying that's a burden that we bear. I've said on this channel, when I make the arguments that I make, I intentionally do not delve into the supernatural element of argument. And it's not because I don't believe them, but because they're not going to be persuasive to the group of people that I'm trying to reach, which is those who are seeking or are unsure, and they're not yet primed enough to believe that that Jesus or any of this could have been supernatural. So I hope that's clear. There's more to say there, but we'll move on here a little bit.
Too much commentary. What's important here is that we have one piece of eyewitness testimony at best, and it should really be zero, depending on the criteria.
We have some hearsay.
So just going to pause on this really quickly, because as framed by Paulogia, this is how the atheist is going to frame. This is how the skeptic is going to frame the argument. They're not going to grant anything. They're not going to give any inch, and they shouldn't. That's the right position to take. We have the burden of either dismantling the pillars that they're standing on, conceding where we need to concede, or showing with better evidence why the positions that are being taken are wrong. So when Paul says there's only one and it shouldn't even be granted that there's one there, if the argument is, did Paul actually see the risen Jesus, Paul's has no obligation to grant that. He has no obligation to grant that. And certainly if the argument is, did Paul see the same risen Jesus that the 12 and perhaps the 500 saw, he has no obligation to grant that and shouldn't. And if the characterization is that whatever it is that Paul saw was some other form of Jesus, then Paulogia is going to say, I don't have to credit that as being evidence of Jesus' resurrection. I don't have to. I don't even in your argument, I don't have to. And he's right on that. And so this is why it's important to separate out Paul's testimony, which is what Paul claims to have seen and witnessed, from whether or not what Paul claims to have seen and witnessed as being true. Paul's testimony that this is what he claims to have seen and witnessed is good historical fact. And we're allowed to and entitled to use that as historic fact, that Paul believes he saw the risen Jesus. Whether or not that's in fact true, again, is an additional burden and it's an additional conversation. So we'll just keep going here so I don't keep repeating the same points.
Hearsay accounts written 2 or so decades or thereabouts after the event.
Cameron is correctly calling the gospel accounts hearsay testimony, and that's best case scenario. They may well not be grounded in any testimony at all, but yes, you've heard it right, they are hearsay.
So I know I touched on this already, but a few things here. So again, if the accounts of Matthew are written by Matthew, then, without getting into the detail of every single account, maybe there's some exceptions here, but we'll just say, to be safe, the vast majority of them would not be hearsay. They simply would not. If it's eyewitness testimony, they would not be hearsay. We've already talked about Paul. And then when we're talking about the accounts written in Luke and Mark, who the historical record doesn't even purport to be eyewitnesses, they are allowed to provide evidence of things that have been presented to them as fact. And that's not hearsay, as long as what we're looking at is their testimony about this is what I've come to learn. I came to learn that Jesus went to the temple. Okay, that whether Jesus in fact went to the temple, if that's what you're arguing, you could argue that's hearsay. But to state that the person who's writing this cannot testify that that's what they've learned is going too far. Okay, I think I've said enough there. Probably there are some lawyers out there who want to chime in and tell me why that's wrong. It's not wrong, but go ahead.
This is all speculation and hearsay.
We have no photographs. The camera wasn't even invented yet. And we also don't have secular confirmation. So, for example, we have no formal contemporaneous, say, Roman investigation concluding that anything mysterious or supernatural happened.
I appreciate that Cameron recognizes that we don't have secular confirmation. Any early secular reports about Jesus or Christianity are merely repeating what they've heard Christians say they believe. They are not independent reports corroborating the alleged events.
So I want to touch on this. This is one of those things where a statement can be true and also still misleading. And so, again, this is not an apology attack. He's getting this is just softballs thrown up to him, and he's just absolutely shredding these as he should. He's just crushing these out of the park, and it's too easy. So the issue here, though, is just on this point of what's secular and what's not. It's an entire conversation in and of itself, but I've asked for this one indulgence, which is to accept the possibility that the accounts that we're talking about in the New Testament, the early parts of the New Testament, are historical. Given that, and even accepting that it's possible that these accounts were written for the purposes of doing evangelical work, we have to be careful about the notion of that as we think of it today, as we would think about it in the first century in this fledgling, burgeoning church. Two entirely different things. The person who wrote Matthew, the person who wrote Luke Acts, even better. It's hard to argue that person was writing to evangelize. Luke states the purpose of why he was writing, the accounts for Theophilus, and we all would love to know who this person was, but Luke states the purpose, and it's gather the accounts as best as I've learned them, so that you can have an sort of orderly and understood account. It's a stretch, and I think it's the weaker argument to say that was for the purpose of advancing some doctrinal or church or Christian belief. It was too early, and the statements were too, and the purposes were clearly stated enough in such a way that just simply reciting these accounts, as Luke did, and Luke described in Luke Acts, in any other context would be considered history. It's just, and so the idea that there's something additional that a Josephus would bring that a Luke would not bring is really, really tough argument to make if you're making that argument, and I think it's weak. The better argument is that the people who were writing these things down at the time, the Luke and the writer of Matthew and Mark, were just writing down the accounts as they had come to know them. And they're really, if there was an evangelical agenda, it was secondary in comparison to just gathering all the information as the best that they could remember. That's the much, much better argument in reading here. So for the purposes of at least historical analysis, the facts, again, not the supernatural claims, as it were. I'm not even arguing those aren't facts, but the facts, the who, the what, the names, the locations, and everything else that's in the Gospels. The reports of Mary arriving to the tomb and finding it empty, and Jesus appearing, the apostles believing that they saw the risen Jesus. Those are facts that that are as valuable as they would, coming from a Matthew or Luke, a Mark, as they would be from anyone else at that time in history. If you want to debate that, you want to argue that, go ahead, throw some comments in. But just want to make that point here. Now, that's a separate point from saying that these accounts prove that Jesus rose from the dead and that Jesus is the Son of God. And Paul's right to say that even if we find some reference to that outside of these texts, there is no, the supernatural accounts of this can't be argued to be corroborated by third parties, certainly not to third parties that would be used, Tacitus, Josephus, etc. And Cameron's argument here that somehow is a weakness of these claims as compared to the Marian apparition claims is really weak, and Paul rightfully dismantles that. So let's move forward here.
But things get much, much more difficult for Jonathan. He is a maximalist. So he thinks the New Testament is generally reliable and that we can therefore use it to establish facts that most historians would actually reject.
That's correct. Most historians reject general reliability of the Gospels, saying the quiet part loud.
So I'll probably wrap up here with this analysis and give a summary here. So first of all, I'm familiar with Dr. McLatchie's work, not all of it, right, but a lot of it, and I think he does great work on the historicity of the New Testament and the Gospel accounts, like really good work. And I think Cameron just, again, it may sound like I'm being hard on Cameron. I don't have anything against him. It was not, but this is just. It's just is not well done argument from Cameron here. Again, I believe that's his name. I don't know that that's his name. I'm calling him that because I think that's what I heard Paulogia saying. It's neither here nor there because this is not personal. But these arguments are really, truly bad arguments. So first, let's just talk about, as I understand Dr. McLatchie's arguments on historicity. It's very similar to what I've been arguing here, and I won't rehash every single point, which is that we can look to these documents in general, the gospel accounts, Acts, Paul's epistles, as providing us very good historical background for the events that are being described. Perhaps Dr. McLatchie goes farther than that and advances them as proof of things that are supernatural, which, by the way, again, it's not the argument that I would make, but if you wanted to make an argument, you would start with this foundation and move forth. As I've said, I personally believe that, but it's a different analysis, and it's more than I can cover in the scope of this. For this purposes, I'm not dealing with that issue, and so I think from my understanding of McLatchie's work, as much as anyone has done a fantastic job of making the points. In fact, some of the points I'm making I've gotten from him, which is that we have good basis to just accept the historical pieces of these accounts as being reliable, more likely to be reliable than not. And so when the rebuttal against this that's being offered here is that most historians don't accept these accounts as being reliable. That's just nonsense. We don't care. I couldn't care less about that. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if 500,000 historians say we don't accept that. It's meaningless. It's not evidence. That's not evidence. If you want to argue it's evidence, and make a strained argument that simply getting a group of historians in a room and say, no, we don't think this is reliable, then it's weakly probative. It has very limited use to help us understand anything, even if we were to grant it as evidence. I argue that it's not even evidence at all, but if you want to argue that it is, it's extremely weak. Where we need experts, where we need those in the field to sort of help us understand things, are on issues like, how does legend develop? How do claims go? Can a legend develop in 10 years? And everything that you've studied, is that consistent? As people who've studied this demonstrate, it can't. It doesn't. Legends don't develop in that short of amount of time, especially where things start to get written down and memorialized. It's just too limited amount of time. That's the kind of thing that's valuable to say. Most historians disagree that legend could have developed, in 10 years. But to say most historians agree that this is history, disagree that this is history, is useless. It's pointless. It doesn't bring anything to the table because we have evidence. We actually have evidence here that's superior to whatever those beliefs are. And if they're going to attack the argument. They have to attack that evidence. They have to say why there's a problem with Matthew, why there's a problem with Mark and Luke, why there's a problem with Paul's epistles, why there's a problem with Acts, how certain parts of the arguments are wrong in a meaningful way, locations are wrong and everything else. And again, the work I've seen from Dr. McLatchie, he does a really good job of showing that's shockingly right. Right in ways that we don't typically see in antiquity, and it's hard to imagine as being fabricated, decades, and some wacky arguments even hundreds of years later, right? So if the only pushback is, well, historians don't accept this as evidence, toss that out. We reject that. We don't even on this channel, we don't even give that any more time than the time I've already given, which is too much. It's just not persuasive at all. We need something more than that if we're going to reject this as evidence. Again, here you're indulging me that this is historical, but in other places, in other videos, in other contexts where you're not willing to grant that, you're going to need to bring more than just this historical consensus thing, because it's nonsense. The last piece here, and what I'm going to wrap up with here, is the problem with the framing that Cameron has done in this context altogether. Because I think the problem with starting with any poor foundation is that usually what is built upon that is also unstable. And so what Cameron argues here is that the case for the Marian apparitions as accounted in Zeitoun is as persuasive or more so because the evidence is better and more contemporary and has secular components to it and everything else than the resurrection accounts. There's one fundamental problem. There are other problems, but there's one fundamental problem with this, and this is, in my opinion, the chief rebuttal that supersedes all the other rebuttals to this. No matter what we say about Zeitoun, one thing we know is that no one there knows or knew what Mary, the mother of Jesus, actually looked like. They never walked with her. They never ate with her. They never camped with her. We have no images of what she looked like. There is absolutely no, if 20,000 people, 100,000 people, 1 million people all come and say we saw Mary, the only thing that they could be describing would be their best understanding of renditions of Mary that have been generated in the hundreds of years or millennia since the accounts in the Gospels. So contrast that to the situation of the Gospel narratives. In the Gospel narratives, again, without getting into the supernatural, the stories are this person who we are saying has reappeared to us is the same person that we walked with, that we ate with, that we camped with, that we listened to, that spoke to us, that preached with us, that cast out demons in front of us, that we spent years with. We know him. This isn't Jehoshaphat from down the street. This isn't that one doppelganger guy at the temple that everybody used to confuse with Jesus, but we knew it wasn't him. This isn't him. This is the actual Jesus in the flesh that we knew. He's the guy that we're telling you we saw. And we have basis to know that because we spent the last 3 years of our lives with this guy. Totally different. Entirely different from Zeitoun. On that basis alone, on that single basis alone, just covering the facts and not getting into the supernatural, just covering the facts makes the factual claim in the Gospels stronger, because if we accept the stories as true, they're coming from people who would have known what Jesus looked like, and so when they say, yeah, this is what we saw, and the 500 are people who, again, the presumption is they would have known what Jesus actually looked like and who he was. It's much more persuasive. And that is not what we have with Zeitoun. I'm not saying Zeitoun is not a miracle. I'm not saying it wasn't Mary. It's nothing to do with what I'm arguing. Could have happened. I'm open to these kinds of events, by the way. I just want to put that out there. I'm open to them because I generally try to follow evidence and because I have an inclination toward accepting things, supernatural events, for reasons of faith that are outside of logic and science and everything else, I am open to them. But I'm just saying, comparing these two is from the outset is a flawed, failed comparison to start with. It's really problematic for the argument that Cameron is putting forth here. And so, why does this matter? Why do we need to understand any of this? And this is what I'm going to close out on. It's because what we're dealing with, for those of us who are in doing the work of apologetics, and again, this is, as I said, this is a side project of mine, but something I'm passionate about and care about. What we're trying to do is establish the good foundations, the good evidentiary foundations for why we believe what we believe. And as I've said, for me, the thing that threw me off was I trusted the Religious Studies Academy to give us the evidence scrutinized, examined, bring the best stuff forward, and I trusted that if a consensus was reached, that was reached based on really good, rigorous work. And for a lot of reasons, as I've discussed elsewhere, it was not. It's important for us, for those of us who are seeking, for those who may be listening to this and are unsure, it's important to understand what we can rely on as being good evidence and what we have to take as on as either faith or on some other grounds. And so the way I want to just wrap up here is to say that the problem I have with arguments like the ones Cameron is making is that he's going to try to prove that Mary did in fact appear at Zeitoun. He's going to try to make a supernatural argument proof from a set of secular facts. It's very difficult to do. I'm not going to say it can't be done, and I don't want to disparage those who dedicate their lives to doing this. It's something that I can't do, and it's something that I don't. At least I can't do in a way that I have conviction about. I get there on other grounds that go beyond what I would describe as logical proof, faith and other things like that. So it's another topic for another time. But the challenge that someone like Cameron has here is he's going to try to argue that Zeitoun is evidence that Mary, the Virgin Mary, Mary the Mother of Jesus, actually appeared to all of these people. And that is just a really tough claim, even with the evidence that he has. Just as the claim that Jesus resurrected from the dead is a tough claim. If that's the claim that you're trying to make, because the evidence that we have can establish the facts, and it becomes a lot harder to establish the supernatural piece. So, long way of saying I'm going to always separate those. And I'm going to talk about, when I'm talking supernatural, you'll know, and I'll be clear about that. But when I'm dealing with arguments generally, here and going forward, my arguments won't rely on proving anything supernatural. I hope that's clear, because the person that I'm trying to reach here is the person who was like me, who wasn't going to listen to that when they were still on their seeking journey. So that's enough on that. I hope you find this helpful. I'm going to link the whole video here. I'll link a couple of other videos in here as well. Thanks for your time.